The following is a conversation with David Zamarin. David Zamarin is an entrepreneur originally based from the Philadelphia area and is best known for his role as the founder and CEO of Detrapel. He has also made appearances on the famous show Shark Tank and the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. Today, he resides in Massachusetts and is focused on building up his company. Here is his story. So, David, did you ever see yourself working for someone else, or was entrepreneurship always the path that you wanted to go down?
So I always thought that I would work for myself. I just didn't know in what capacity and when. Since I was a little kid, I always loved business, but I love the intersection of business and education. So my entire life, because I had a very unique dichotomy where my parents were divorced, and my dad was very business focused, whereas my mom's side of the family was very much pushing education and thereby also pushing me to be an attorney my whole life. I thought I was going to be an attorney for up until maybe the first 15 years of my life, and at that point, after doing several internships, I learned one that if I was going to be an attorney, I had to be an attorney for myself, like have my own practice, and then further, I realized that I excelled much better and probably chose the better path of entrepreneurship.
Got it. Interesting. So you were just, though being a lawyer wasn't a vibe. You were just like, this sounds like a lot of, obviously entrepreneurship is a lot of work, but you just got the vibe that being a lawyer wasn't right. And you were like, I just should just do my own thing.
No, I loved it. I loved a lot of the internships. I took classes, like full-time law school classes, while I was in high school at UPenn, over a summer. Actually, I got credits for them. This is like when I was maybe an incoming junior
Back in the day.
to high school. Yeah, it's a little while ago. And so I thought I would love it, and I think I did love a lot of parts of it. But I particularly changed my mindset after doing a few internships. I did one. My first one was for a sole proprietor, which I loved. I loved the fact that this guy was a young, I think he was like 31, 32-year-old practitioner. He had one experience at a larger firm and then started his own thing right away. And he got to do whatever the hell he wanted, whenever he wanted, with whatever startups he wanted. And he was really cool. This guy, Lee Schlamowitz, like American Jew, and just was really, really cool. Cool guy, and I still use him for some minor stuff here and there. He's great. But under his purview, when I interned for him, I loved it, and I fell in love with it, and I thought this is what I was going to do. But then my later internships, I did them at some mid-sized firms. I did it at some larger firms in Philly. And when I experienced essentially like the quintessential, especially prior to COVID, workplace environment of being an intro level intern, and I was a free intern too, usually for managing partners, so I got a great experience being directly in the field and like not having to be considered someone's bitch, for a lack of better words.
Sure.
Because if you're a paid intern, and especially in high school and in college too, but especially in high school, you're the coffee goer, right? You're the coffee runner. You got to go buy the coffee. Yeah, whatever it is, right? But I didn't have that experience. I got a pretty real experience and got to actually work and learn on several different cases and documents. And for me, I realized that going into high stakes corporate law, which is what I thought I wanted to do, but just with my own practice, was actually a lot less sexy and glamorous than it seemed. And that it would end up being a lot less fun than what I would have wanted. It, a lot more reading, a lot more writing, a lot more splitting the difference, negotiating style, which I can't stand, and just not real solution providing environment, and that's not how I envisioned myself as an individual. And so, as I matured, I kind of realized that I wanted to have that freedom of doing kind of whatever I wanted, and be able to provide solutions in the way that I thought was the best. And so, yeah, I dropped the dream, crushed my mom, but I think she accepts, rightfully so, what's gone on since.
For sure, and it's great to hear. I think you also brought up a great point, and a lot of times we can learn about something. So learning about the law can be really interesting because we learn about how different cases go and whatnot. But a lot of times, and I'm sure a lot of people can attest to this, and as you did as well, once we actually get into the field and start doing, learning about something and then doing it are actually two different things. So once you're in the field and you're like, this isn't for me, it's great that you're able to come up with that conclusion, for sure.
Yeah, and I'm a pretty stubborn individual usually with things like that. So I'm a very disciplined person, and so for me, if I believe that something is tough, I actually feel more inclined to stick with it. So
Hmm.
I'm very happy for whatever reason that that one time I didn't choose to stick with it and I didn't move forward with the law kind of pursuit, um, because in another world I absolutely would have.
Yeah, for sure. On that note, there's a Russian saying, kind of, I don't want to butcher it, but it's like "Что не бывает, бывает для лучше."
Yeah,
So for everyone that doesn't understand that, it's basically everything that doesn't happen happens for the better. So
exactly.
awesome to see that happen in your case. But also, you've been on this really awesome, incredible entrepreneurial journey. But every one of our journey has our start. So what was your first entrepreneurial venture or your first company?
Oh man, my first company is definitely different than my first entrepreneurial venture. I did the quintessential like Northeast Russian Jewish type of hustle, buy, sell, flip stuff.
Hmm.
The first thing that I did as a kid, I was always entrepreneurial. So when I grew up, as soon as my parents got divorced, my mom lived in the Northeast, and it was kind of like closer to a shittier area, or at least now what's considered a shittier area, Philly. And I remember like my grandmother. I lived with my grandparents for the first few years, and I remember my grandmother um, buying popsicles or freezing popsicles for me, and then telling me to go hand them out in like the neighborhood in the apartment complex that we lived, where there was a ton of kids.
Hmm.
And I was supposed to give them out to my friends and so on and so forth, but I actually used to sell them. And so I was always entrepreneurial as a young kid, and that was probably because I always yearned for a sense of freedom.
Hmm.
I saw my parents, both my parents for that matter, but in particular my mom, really struggled during my first few years. I remember living in a different environment, and while my dad also had his own struggles and his own entrepreneurial journey that was very difficult, um, it was different because I lived with my mom and I saw her working in retail of really long shifts, and I didn't live with her because of that. I lived
Hmm.
with my grandparents as a result. Um, Whereas, my dad had his own house and he was better off, and so at the time, I just realized that for me, I wanted freedom. I
Hmm.
wanted the opportunity to be able to kind of build my own path. And I was raised really well. Like I'm very appreciative, despite the hardships that my family's had, and the hardships that I had to endure as a result. Like my brothers have no idea. I have two younger brothers who have vastly different age gaps than me,
Hmm.
and so they grew up with a silver spoon in comparison. And I'm just so happy that I didn't have that opportunity because it made me who I am today. Um, but as a result, I think ultimately I was incredibly entrepreneurial from a young age. I wanted freedom desperately. And then when I got into about fifth or sixth grade is when I started my first business, which was just really flipping fake beats and G Shocks at the time.
Hmm.
Which is, a few kids did that in our community. And
It's a
so,
typical for starting up, but for those that don't know, grow up, me and David know each other from childhood, and in our area, the kind of the Northeast hustle, people would buy stuff, try to honestly
yeah,
a lot like what they do in the stock market. They try to buy something, then advertise it as more value than it is, and sell it off. So
pretty
different
much.
environment, but same kind of vibe.
Yeah, and so it was a means to an end for me. It was a money making thing for me, and at the time, that's all I really wanted. And I started getting into investment culture really, really young because my dad was in the financial industry and real estate and stuff like that. So I it's funny, I would make money, and then because my parents were super strict, I didn't like really have a way to spend it, because if I bought new stuff, my mom would see it and she'd be like, "Where'd you buy this? Why'd you buy it?" So on and so forth. So I would avoid getting the questioning, and instead what I did is I took the money and I invested it. So like my dad would do hard money loans, for example, or whatever, and so I would participate in these investments. And so it was quite funny for me at the time, looking back at it. But I was trying to make it happen. And then my first real company experience was my freshman year of high school. So I was very fortunate that it was admitted both to the middle school and high school, um, which is Julia Reynolds Masterman School in Philadelphia, which is the top school in the state, top seventh in the country. And it's a public magnet school, so you have to test to get in. And again, I was fortunate enough to get in. But when I got into the high school in particular, because you had to reapply for the high school, even if you were in the middle school previously, and it was incredibly, incredibly competitive. Out of the million kids in the school district, not everyone applied, but out of the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands that applied, only 100 were admitted per grade. So it was
Hmm.
incredibly, incredibly competitive. And what I noticed was when I got in, I looked around, and up until this point, I still thought that I was going to go into law. My parents, again, always pushed education, and I was always told that as a kid I was going to have to go to Ivy League.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, if when I got in, if all these 99 other peers of mine looked this good on paper and were these like so smart individuals, I thought they were all geniuses. I had imposter syndrome. I was like, I don't really belong here. I'm not sure why I'm here. Like, I'm good. I'm smart. I get good grades. That's not necessarily, and I try hard, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like, I wasn't necessarily just that naturally committed to being able to study for 10 hours straight like a lot of my peers did. I had other, aspirations. And so I just thought, man, I don't belong here. How can I stand out, especially when I'm going to be applying for my universities and colleges and stuff like that. And so I ended up going outside of school to a youth entrepreneurship program.
Mm-hmm.
Pure coincidence that I got in as well. I was the only non-senior in the program. But in my freshman year, I got into this program that was held out of First Round Capital, which is Philly's most experienced venture capital firm and probably top 10 in the US. Huge firm. Founder Josh Kaufman's like this crazy VC he's the former founder of Half.com, which sold to eBay in 2004 or 5 for like $350 million. And he had a very nice exit as a result. And he's, an early investor in Google, Skype, pretty much every major tech company.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got this amazing mentorship on a weekly basis, 2 to 3 times a week, by going to this program. And they had new mentors coming in every other week. And I soaked it all up. I was the kid that took it the most serious. I was the youngest, but I was relentless. I believed in the program. I believed in entrepreneurship. I fell in love with it. And I fell in love with solving problems. And to me, my first problem, a really long answer to a pretty short question. My first problem as a freshman in high school was that I had a pair of Jordans that I got as a gift for getting into Masterman from my grandparents, and I hated getting them dirty. So I wanted to come up with a film that could be peeled off whenever it got stained. But I didn't know anything about chemistry, so some of my early mentors recommended that I pivot the idea to a shoe cleaning company. And at first I was really, really against it because I had pride. I didn't want to clean people's shoes. I thought it was pretty beneath me. But, I was a 14-year-old kid. Nothing should have been beneath me. And so I swallowed the pride, and I took that idea. And what we ended up doing is we became a conditioning company for local university sports teams, where we would take their shoes on a biweekly basis and clean them, repair them, condition them, give them back. And I ran that business as a freshman in high school for about 6 months before having an exit. And at the peak of it, we were making $25K a month in revenue, and I was alone in the business. It was literally just me in terms of actually operating. And it was like 90-something% margins. It was all, it was all service-based business. So there weren't any real startup costs. And so that business went very well. And I got an opportunity, very fortunate, to sell it 6 months in. And it just made a lot of sense because I saw the vision for Detrapel coming to life afterward.
Got it. On that note, you mentioned Detrapel, which is what you're mainly known for. So, one, how did you make that transition? And two, where did you initially just get the idea for Detrapel?
Yeah, so the initial idea was like this, this film that could be peeled off. And since I pivoted the idea to the shoe cleaning company, we wanted to offer a conditioning service, which at the time was a competitor of Detrapel's, which was a company called Ultra Everdry. They're no longer really in business. And the reason is because I bought that product. It was $1,600 for a little quart, super expensive. But most importantly, you have to buy a respirator mask and a full body suit to apply it. And I didn't understand the concept as to why for the longest time. But 6 months into it, after selling my first business, I realized I just started asking naive questions, and I looked into it, and I realized I learned about fluorochemistry or PFAS chemicals. And that's when I realized that this chemistry was incredibly carcinogenic, hence all the protective gear that you needed to wear to apply it. And afterward, I started researching nanotechnology, came across the lotus leaf effect, and really just started asking really, really naive questions and Googling the heck out of everything. And eventually, that's how the initial idea, that summer after selling my first business, that Detrapel was born. Detrapel, the word or the name comes from Detrahera, which is the Greek word. I literally just Googled the translation for like repelling. And then the pel is part of repel. So I just combined it. So it wasn't that creative. But But the idea was that we wanted to come up with a film. And at the time, since doing a thicker film, and in part of my research, doing a thicker film had its own complications. It made sense to do a nano-based coating that could be applied onto, at that point, fabrics. That's what I was thinking about it for. And it could repel liquid-based substances. That has obviously transpired into something much larger today, but that is the initial start of it.
Got it. Interesting. So starting this company, after having your initial exit and thinking of a way to make, a safer or less carcinogenic solution, I'm sure you had a ton of challenges early on. Do you remember any of the significant ones that you had to deal with, and how were you able to kind of get over those humps?
There are a ton. There's still challenges every day. But the first 5 years were particularly difficult because the research that I was doing, again, thanks to the school that I went to, we had a phenomenal program where if you were admitted, which pretty much everyone was, you were allowed to take classes as a part-time undergraduate student for full-blown credits, like full-blown classes with other undergrads at UPenn during the evenings. So for 3 years, I took different classes, and some of those classes, in particular, I did a little bit of a shadowing program in one of the summers from one of the leading researchers at the Singh Center for Nanotechnology at Penn. And that's where I came up with the initial idea for what was at the time a photocatalytic titania, which, in layman's terms, just means it's a sun or UV activated titanium dioxide molecule, which would react in a way that would get you this super hydrophobic or oleophobic effect. In other words, it would repel liquids at a really high rate. And so that was the initial research that I did, and I based on some of the studies that I had at Penn and in high school. But we struggled significantly for years to scale it up out of the lab. Once I got the basic MVP, the initial rutile figured out, that was great. And we could do that all day in 1 gallon batches or even half-gallon batches in the lab, left and right. But as soon as we started trying to scale it beyond 5 gallons, it would consistently separate and break. And that became a significant challenge for nearly 5 years of the company's history. So for the first 5 years, we struggled significantly, and all of the work that we were doing were off of like lab-based sample sizes, which was difficult because we had to have customers or conversations with people that were looking for 275 gallon batches at a time, which is called the tote in my industry. They were looking for 20 of those on a truck every week. So there was no way I was gonna be able to do that out of a lab. And so I contracted outside labs, and for 5 years nonstop, we just couldn't figure it out. No lab I hired like 4 different ones, top nanotech research facilities out there. And we just couldn't figure it out. No one could. Not until we at one point brought everything in house and hired our own chemical staff, and eventually my CTO, who now works here full time, obviously. But there are so many challenges, but the first one that comes to mind is, the first 5 years of the company wasn't a company; it was a complete fabrication of an idea and trying to make it work. And we were so ahead of the time because 10 years ago, no one talked about PFAS. No one. Now it's the talk of everything because there's so much legislation that's coming out banning PFAS, and there's over, I think, $13 billion worth of pending litigation against companies that use PFAS. So it's a massive problem today. But 10 years ago when I started the company, no one cared.
Got it. So you're able to hop on it early. And I think one of the things that you said brings to mind a quote by David Ben-Gurion. That was in this one book that I read. He said that if you can't find an expert that agrees with you, find another expert. Or sorry, that's not the exact quote. I remember the exact quote. If an expert says it can't be done, then find another expert. So I like that you kind of kept going to lab and you're like, no, you guys are going to figure this thing out. And then ultimately you brought someone in-house and were able to kind of get that done. So that's awesome to hear. Speaking of earlier challenges, and I know you just mentioned you had trouble for the first 5 years, really trying to get the basic formula to work. Other than kind of the core of essentially what was your company, since without that stuff wouldn't have scaled, did you ever have any other doubts regarding your ability to scale or just kind of grow as a company?
Yeah, I mean, certainly along the way, I had plenty of doubts. I had doubts in myself. Who am I kidding? Of course, there were moments I doubted myself as a leader. There were moments I doubted myself as a proper CEO or a proper founder. I mean, we're an institutionalized company now. We've got significant venture capital behind us. I have corporate venture capital arms that have invested 7 figures into the company. Like we have multi-billion-dollar organizations behind us now, and so there's a little bit of imposter syndrome there, right? Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm very confident. I believe I belong in the room, and I've proven that. But the reality is I'm a now 20. I just turned 26-year-old founder CEO who's at the table with Fortune 50 publicly traded companies, trying to sell them, the coatings that we make, which are highly, highly technical, to PhDs who've been doing this for 30 years and haven't found the solution. And so, of course, there were tons of times that we felt we were a little over our head, but we knew what we were doing, and we were confident that we were the right solution in the market. And so, there were plenty of challenges along the way, and I can point to many where I've had a lot of doubters. I've had a lot of people that were skeptical about the technology, but once they started looking at it themselves, and we always invite customers over to visit our facility because we're the way I believe in hardcore entrepreneurship. What I mean by that is I believe there's a strong delineation between business and entrepreneurship, and they're not the same in my opinion. I think what we think of as every typical like Northeast Russian kid thinks about business. They have no clue what it means to be an entrepreneur. And it's so different. It couldn't be more different. And so when you come into our facility, when we invite a customer or a prospect or a supplier, whoever, when they come to see our facility, they see two things. They see, one, a facility that is insanely vertically integrated for the size of company that we are. We're just at 20 people. We'll be at 24 by the end of the year, and we'll probably double in size next year. But the idea is, for the amount of work and for what we do as a company, because we have 3 brands underneath the corporate umbrella, we are so lean. And then the second thing that they see is what we do today isn't just like, we don't buy like ready-made chemicals on the market and mix them and sell them. We synthesize our own chemistry. It's very high tech. And so, sure, you've got a 26-year-old founder CEO who's very young, energetic, built a phenomenal team around him. But when you actually come to see what we do, or you speak to our CTO, who's got 40 years of experience in the industry, who's literally a world-renowned researcher, you start to realize this isn't some college project, or this isn't some startup that has some research behind it and it really has no business talking to some of these types of organizations. We're a legit company. It's very different. Like we've got real shareholders that we report to, and there's just a lot that goes into it. So without divulging too much more and keeping this answer as succinct as possible, it's not what people think.
Yep, for sure. And once you have kind of venture backing, you have probably investors breathing. Well, we'll call them nice people, but they want to see results. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate. I raised capital in a super non-traditional way. We've been profitable in many years prior, so I never raised capital really. Not really. I never really raised capital because we needed capital. We raised capital because we saw growth opportunity and we wanted to maximize it and fuel the fire. And so I've been very fortunate that a lot of my investors, especially my Series A investors, which are all venture capital firms, are phenomenal partners. And I couldn't ask for better partners out of them.
Got it. It's great to hear great investors making great partners. One of the things that you said earlier is kind of entrepreneurship when you're young, especially being a little in over your head, which I think is a little fair. I mean, to kind of start a company or do something, you have to be a little irrational. But one of the things one of the things that you got to experience as an entrepreneur is kind of maybe every entrepreneur's dream is to go on Shark Tank. So can you speak a little bit about what that experience was like and how you're able to kind of kill it on the show?
Yeah, indeed, that was a dream of mine. As a kid growing up with my dad, I would watch Shark Tank, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I once envisioned myself there. And I recall my dad. I remember when I told my dad one time that I'd love to be on Shark Tank one day. And credit to my parents. My parents never told me I couldn't do it. My parents told me if I thought about something, I could achieve it. It was all in my hands. Now, the downside of that, or the flip side, is that I never got any freaking help from anyone. So it was very difficult. It was a brutal road to get to where we are. But, the credit is due where credit is due. And my parents never stifled my imagination. So when I was 15, I had just turned 16 when I had officially just incorporated Detrapel, and we had our first significant batch made out of the lab that worked. And this was February of 2014. I remember it vividly. I was sitting at First Round Capital, and I watched a partner at FRC at first round, um, Chris Fralick, give a talk for Forbes where he said he pretty much gave a speech on how to get a hold of the 10 busiest people that you know. And it was a step-by-step guide on how to craft the perfect email. That's really what it was.
Hmm.
This is before email was like completely inundated with spam like it is now.
Yeah.
But back then this worked. And so I read or watched the video, read the article, took notes, and took it super seriously. And I emailed him, the partner, who didn't necessarily know who I was, but I was kind of involved the first round somewhat. And so I emailed him, and he replied, and I said, "That's great. I'd love to meet with him," and so on and so forth. But then I also then emailed the managing director, Josh Koppelman, who had heard of me, but I've never spoken to him, and things of that nature. And so I reached out to him, and he went and bought a couple bottles, and I was so impressed that I was getting these answers via email from these super busy CEOs who I looked up to and was like, oh my god, this is like the equivalence of, I won't say God, but
Something like
some
that.
idol that I have, right?
Yeah.
And I was just shocked I was getting answers, and so I learned how to data hunt around the same time, and specifically email hunt, data mine and email hunt. And so I started email hunting for Mark Cuban's email, and I happened to find it online, which now everyone knows it's publicly available. You can
Mhm.
find one of his like 5 emails online. And so I found one of them at the time, and I drafted the same thing. I violated some of the rules because I ended up drafting an entire novel, which I shouldn't have done. But
Very
I,
entrepreneurial of you.
yeah, and I sent him an email, and he replied. And in my reply to his reply, I mentioned Shark Tank, and so he's actually the one that introduced me to the casting producers. And I waited to apply about 4 years. Like, they kept following up every year and asking me if I was ready to apply. And I really wasn't for the first 4 years, and
Mhm.
so um, fast forward to 2017, the summer of 2017, it was an eventful summer, but I was part of an accelerator program, and I thought to myself, this is the year. Why not? Let's go big or go home. Might as well give it a shot. This was, maybe 8 months or 6 months after I had a huge epiphany in the company, because there was a moment in time my freshman year in college that I thought I was going to actually quit the business completely and get rid of it. So there are plenty of times where you have thoughts
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
But 6 months later, I'm like applying for this, and we got in, and there's a whole story to it too, because at first they gave me a rejection email when they meant to give me an acceptance email, and I was one of the wrong companies that got the wrong email. And long story short, I was accepted, and it's a crazy brutal process. I'm happy to go into a little bit more depth about it, um, but it's super difficult, inundative, like crazy, over 200-page application between the two different things that you have to submit. And eventually, fast forwarding a little bit, I got onto the show, and I filmed in front of the sharks, which was a crazy experience in and of itself. But I got an offer from 4 out of the 5 sharks, and I took a deal with 2 of them.
Okay, that's awesome. Another thing I wanted to ask about Shark Tank, a lot of times we see snippets of an episode or kind of snippets of a pitch, which is like 10, 15 minutes. In
Yeah.
reality, how long were you up there pitching to them?
So I got one of the quicker deals in history. Mine was like 36 minutes or so.
Wow.
The average pitch is 90 minutes long.
Got it. That's insane. 36 minutes is even, you're like one of the quickest deals. I'm like 36. Well, I'm also thinking in TV context. So I'm sure for them, 36 minutes isn't bad, but to see the whole pitch, I think would be really interesting. So awesome
Oh
that you
yeah,
were
no.
able to do that.
I'm glad it's not public.
Yeah.
Yeah, they scale down like the best parts for TV, I suppose. But it's a real thing. It's not. It's a TV show. Don't get me wrong, but
Mhm.
it's not scripted. Like it's legit. It's a real thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure at least Mark Cuban and I think Michael Rubin was on the show too. I think when you're
Yep,
north of $1 billion status, you're kind of just having fun at that point, deciding what to do with your money. So awesome
pretty
that you're
much.
able to get that experience, and you're up to still a lot of really exciting stuff now. Where do you see the company going in the next 5, 10 years? Is this something that you want to run for the rest of your life? Maybe eventually get bought out and work for someone else, or right now you're just kind of enjoying the wave of where you're going.
Yeah, well, I think de facto, since I've raised money, there's I'm not staying here for the rest of my life. The reality is I I'm not a big generational like wealth or generational business type of believer. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it. It's just in my particular case, I want my kids to achieve their success on their own too, and
Mhm.
so I never envisioned passing this down to my kids. The goal is eventually to either go public or sell the company, and that's been the objective since day one.
Mhm.
So we in the next 5 to 10 years very well could have an acquisition. If we went public, it'd probably be closer to the 10-year mark. But if we decided to have a strategic acquire us, or maybe a private equity fund acquire us, then that would probably be in that like 3 to 7 year range. And that's possible. I mean, we've had PE knock on our door already, so this isn't necessarily something that is off the table. But in the meantime, the reality is what we're working on is massive, and so I'm more concerned about first solving the problems, making the impact that we want to make, and the money and the acquisition and all those other components that'll come. You first do good. You first build a strong business, a strong company, and then you worry about the acquisition and getting out of the company. So for right now, what I'm focused on is building what we need to make the biggest impact possible throughout whatever industry that we choose to participate in.
I think it's a great mindset to have. You just kind of worry about adding value, and everything else will take care of itself. But
yeah.
do you ever think about, say if you get acquired by a strategic acquire, and hopefully they keep you on, as you probably are the brains of the operation. The business isn't worth definitely as much without you. But say, for example, you have the option to just kind of exit this completely. Do you ever think about what life would look like, after this company? What else you would take on? If you would take some time off?
I'd be so bored 2 months later when I start something new. I'm a solutions guy. So, and I do a lot today. Like, Detrapel is by far my main focus and that I do, what I'm known for. But, I've got other things on the side, not other startups, but, I do other things. And so, the reality is, I take a well-needed break in the sense of like, I pursue some of my hobbies more aggressively. I've got tons of hobbies, which I love to pursue when I'm free. The problem is that I'm rarely ever free. So I pursue some of those, but the reality is I would get bored within 2 months max. I guarantee it. And I'd have to start something else. And so I do know some of the things that I would start if that were to happen today. But the reality is that 5 years from now, or whatever timeline it's going to be, the world's going to be a different place. And so, we'll see if those ideas ever make relevance in the future. But
yeah, for sure. We'll see when we get there. I think it's a fair answer too. I think a lot of people who aren't entrepreneurial or who haven't taken that path think like, oh, I'll take that path and then I'll exit, and then, I'll have a lifetime's worth of money and then just chill. But reality is, I think if people don't feel like they're adding value internally, they're going to be a little depressed. So maybe take a month or two off, but more than that, I feel like people will just be like, okay, I need to do something else with my life, or I'm going to lose my mind.
Yeah, there's just not. I mean, I think life is beautiful. There's just so much to do. And while some of those things are personal hobbies, I find that especially in the event of having an exit, and likely a successful one, the chances are I will be able to do those fun time hobbies that leave impact to me while pursuing something else that has greater impact as well.
Got it. Say, for example, I don't know if you're mentoring anyone, but say, a young entrepreneur came up to you and
I do.
It's awesome that kind of you mentor, and definitely that rewarding experience. So you've probably had this question asked to you on a little more of an intimate basis, but curious to hear, typically what you would say. But say one of your kind of mentees or one of your entrepreneurs comes to you and, they say they're going through a really, really tough patch in their company, be it, all by the many issues an entrepreneur can have. How do you go about advising them to really get through that hump?
It's tough. It depends on the scenario. Every situation is different. Every company is different, and every founder is different. The challenge is, what people often forget is that a lot of the challenges that we have as founders or as entrepreneurs is you have the actual crux of the problem, whatever that may be. It could be, let's say, you're having supplier issues, or your supplier went bankrupt, or is going out of business, or rose the price by 2x overnight.
Out of your control.
Yeah, things that affect the business greatly, but you can't necessarily control. And the one thing that everyone always forgets is that there are significant emotions tied to this, to living the lifestyle that you have to live if you're running a company like I am, for example, because it's not just you that's at stake. You've got people that rely on you, staff, friends, family, whatever, that are literally their livelihood depends on you, but also everything that you've built is identified as part of this company. And so there are a lot of emotions that are baked into this. So the first thing that generally happens is if someone is experiencing an issue, the first thing that you want to do is really first understand what can you control. And normally, the common denominator is you can always control yourself and how you're going to react in your emotions. And so the first thing that we do is we focus on something like that. And my mentors do the same thing with me too. I just had one of my longest mentors. I have a biweekly call 5 different people who are 5 different mentors of mine, and I often rotate once I graduate from some advice with them. But this one in particular that I had even this morning, my 8 a.m. call on every other Friday, is with a longtime Philly entrepreneur, actually founder, who sold a big portion of his company recently, and super well off, and just a phenomenal mentor. I've had him for I've known him for 8 to 9 years or so, or 8 years, and I went back to him maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, and we've been consistent every 2 weeks since. But he does the same thing with me too. Like today, I worked through 3 different, 2 of which were personal issues as opposed to like a professional one. Obviously, quasi work related or company related, but personal. And the first thing that we always talk about is, how am I controlling it? What are my emotions? How do I approach the situation first? Because in order to solve any problem, you got to go in with a clear mindset. And so for us, the number one thing that we do is first identify what do the emotions of the person who's first involved, what do those look like? And then we try to understand the flip side, and then we try to find a pragmatic approach that solves both ends of the eye.
That's fair. So essentially, kind of high level, control what you can control. Ideally, your emotions, which is the toughest thing. Unfortunately, we're not machines, and we can't operate at 100% efficiency. But ultimately, kind of realize that control what you can control, and sometimes stuff happens, and you just have to kind of roll with the punches and move forward.
Exactly. I would just add that when I say emotions, I don't necessarily mean like the basics of, oh, I'm feeling sad, or this makes me upset, or this is very difficult and I'm overwhelmed and anxious.
Much more complex.
What I mean, and what I mean by it is that how are you going to rationalize the other person's thinking and therefore your response as a result? It's a lot more complex.
So dealing with the complexities for sure. If you could go back kind of to 10-year-old David and give him advice, what would it be?
Yeah, to start earlier. Yeah, if I started maybe 10 years ago, or sorry, if I was where I'm at now 10 years ago, who knows what would have been the case. No, I'm partially being facetious, but I think realistically, for me, when I was a kid, I don't necessarily, I wouldn't change this, but I yearned for a lot of justification and a lot of gratification through external means. I had a lot of pressure put onto me from my family from day one, because I was literally the moment I was freaking born, and my parents still tell this story to this freaking day. It annoys me. Our family friend, who was our doctor, came into the room and said, this person's going to be someone. And my parents have held me to that goddamn standard since I was born. And I'm so appreciative for it. But the reality is that a normal person probably wouldn't be able to handle the amount of pressure. I'm glad that I went through it. But at 10 years old, I think the one thing that I would have said is I would have tried to learn to get that satisfaction and fill the void that I had about not feeling good enough, or feeling as if I wasn't meeting my parents' expectations or the expectations that I put onto myself thanks to my upbringing. I would have tried filling those voids internally more than I did externally.
Got it. And do you think that might have helped you manage kind of whatever emotional difficulties you had moving forward, kind of getting that done at a younger age?
Maybe.
Tough to say, probably.
I don't know. It's a great question. I would assume so. I would assume so, because I would have been even more, it would be more emotionally intelligent at this point. But no, I think it's a really tough thing for any, kid to go through. And to some degrees, I'm still a kid, like in many ways. And so at the end of the day, growing up in that setting that I did had its many benefits, incredible discipline that I got out of that. And that's great. And I would never change that for a second. It's just, I think I lost a lot of relationships early on in life because of this need for this external validation elsewhere. That would have been through my education, through my work, or through my athletics, whatever it may have been. I was focused on those things sometimes more than others. And so that definitely affected some things. But then again, I don't regret anything at all, because I wouldn't be who I am today. And when you're a kid, the great thing that you could do is you can look back and say, I was a kid, sorry, can we start fresh, when now you're 27, 26 years old. So
yep. life happens, and kind of we live and we learn. And if we look back and we see things we acted or did that, we can always be like, I could have done this or that better, but I'm a little older, so hopefully I can act better. So I can definitely resonate with you on that point. If you could have dinner with anyone in history, dead or alive, who would it be?
Can I answer both a dead and alive?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you can answer 10 people if you want. Any, it's your
There
answer.
are a lot. There are a lot. It's going to be hard to find just one. I'd probably have to say, if dead, that's a tough one. There's so many that I could pick. I'm not sure who I would want to go
You're
after.
like, I don't want to disrespect any dead people here by picking one.
Yeah, exactly, right. Let me come back to the dead one because now I'm gonna try to find one that's alive. But to be honest, I'd probably go for the cliche answer of Jeff Bezos, but probably for a non-cliche reason.
Mhm.
Um, the simple reason behind it is I'm fascinated by how people think. So
Mhm.
I would love to learn what does what does his mindset look like at his stage now and what his stage was previously and how that
Mhm.
has changed. Um, that's like one of the few people I'd love to. The other people are a lot less notorious than that.
Got it.
Um, but yeah, that's probably where I would start. As for debt, I'd have to get back to that. That
No
one's
worries.
a long list.
Can't go wrong with Jeff Bezos. Do you have a favorite book that you've read recently that you think a lot of people should look into?
There are a lot of good books. Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss is great if you're into negotiation and just trying to be more emotionally intelligent as it relates to negotiating, especially. So that's a phenomenal book. Some of the classics like How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie is really great. And then a book that changed my thinking as a founder, even though I would have identified as a founder that did do those things, was I'm blanking on the name. It's about getting the right people on the bus. Oh my god, it's a classic. Hold on, it's definitely my Audible.
No, no worries.
I'll pull it up. It's a good book. People should read it, and it's a classic that everyone
Mhm.
should know. Uh, Good to Great by Jim Collins. There you go.
Got it. Good to great. Okay.
And then if it's not business related, the best book I think I personally have ever read, um, which I think truthfully changed my life, even though I was, in my opinion, very disciplined and motivated already, was David Goggins' first book, Can't Hurt Me.
Can't hurt me. It's definitely on the list. So I think you can't go wrong with those two. On this entrepreneurial journey that you've had and kind of that's going to only keep going and take you on a lot of these loops and highs and downs that, for sure in the future, from everything that's happened so far, what would you say that you're the most grateful for in this whole journey?
My parents, my upbringing.
Got it. Definitely shaped you the most into what you are today.
Yeah, 100%.
Got it. What would you say brings you the most happiness in life?
Um, Probably the most happiest I've ever felt was when I felt like true freedom to be
Mhm.
able to walk out and do what I want with the people that I want. And so generally what that usually means for me is we've made a significant impact here at the company level where I can then go and enjoy the fruits of of that labor in the sense of like enjoying time with my loved ones, and particularly like I'm married, so my wife, my family, my brothers, and then my closest friends too, who are all we're all entrepreneurs. So um, I think for me, it's it all comes back to the freedom to operate, kind of do as I see fit, how I see fit, when I see fit.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's one of the most empowering feelings in the world.
To be free.
Yeah.
Relatively within reason, but for sure
Yeah, for sure.
understand that. On that note, David, you've had this incredible journey. You've been through the ups, the downs, and we'll see where that journey takes you. Are there any final words that you want to share, whether it's business advice, relationship advice, life advice, Detrapel, Surepel advice? The final word is yours, my man.
Honestly, I would encourage any young listener or even old listener that if you're thinking about starting a company, don't don't do it. No, I'm kidding. That you if you're genuinely interested, and you have to really soul search a little bit and make sure that this is truly something that you want. But if it is something that you truly want, then the best time to start is now. You have to start as early as possible, because the later that you go or the longer that you wait, the less opportunity that you have and the more risk that you take.
Got it. That's fair. David, thanks so much for that final word, and thanks for taking the time to go on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with David Zamarin. If you enjoyed the episode, rate the show on Spotify, drop a comment on YouTube, and subscribe.